Dr. Robert Wells was moments from losing everything, his career, his freedom. The evidence was damning. The prosecutor smirked. Her assistant watched, knowing the trap had worked. Then a voice cut through the silence. "That's not true!" A 12-year-old boy stood, fists clenched. "I know who really did it." The courtroom froze. Everything was about to change. The courtroom erupts into hushed murmurs. The accusation is impossible, unthinkable, a child pointing a finger at a trusted legal professional in the middle of a high-profile trial. Daniel Reeves, standing beside prosecutor Melissa Bailey, remains motionless for a split second, his face blank. Then, he exhales sharply, as if snapping out of shock, and lets out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me?" His voice is calm, measured. He turns toward the judge. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Are we seriously entertaining accusations from a child?" Judge Carmichael's eyes darken. His gavel slams down once again, the sharp crack cutting through the whispers. "Quiet." His gaze locks onto Jake, studying the boy as if deciding whether to throw him out or let him speak. A long, tense pause follows. Then, in a clipped tone, the judge says, "Explain yourself. Now." Jake's heart pounds against his ribs. He feels the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. His throat is dry, his hands clammy, but he can't back down now. "I saw the bank statements," Jake says, forcing his voice to stay steady, "the ones that were used as evidence in this case." A flicker of confusion crosses Melissa Bailey's face. "What are you talking about?" she asks, shooting a glance at Reeves, who remains eerily composed. Jake clenches his fists. "The money didn't go into Dr. Wells' account," he says, his voice louder now, stronger. "It was rerouted. Someone changed the transfer path, made it look like he stole it, but the funds actually ended up somewhere else." The murmurs grow louder. The jury, once passive observers, are now leaning forward in their seats. Judge Carmichael's gaze sharpens. "And where exactly did the money go?" Jake's stomach twists. He had double-checked the records himself over and over, trying to convince himself that he was wrong. But he wasn't. "Offshore accounts, under the name DR." This time, the reaction is instant. A visible ripple of tension spreads across the courtroom. DR. Daniel Reeves. Reeves finally moves, tilting his head slightly, watching Jake like one might observe a bug crawling across the floor. "This is absurd," he says, scoffing. "Your Honor, we are moments away from concluding this trial, and now a child, who is not a witness nor part of these proceedings, is making baseless accusations?" Judge Carmichael ignores him. He leans forward, eyes locked onto Jake. "How do you know this?" Jake swallows hard. He can feel Reeves's eyes boring into him, but he forces himself to focus. This is it. "I overheard him talking," Jake says, his voice unwavering now. "Last week, in the hallway. He thought no one was listening." A sharp breath from somewhere in the room. Jake remembers every word as clearly as if it were playing back in his mind. "Idiots like Wells make it too easy. Nobody checks the fine print. Nobody ever does." Jake looks directly at Reeves now. "You said those words, didn't you?" Reeves doesn't answer, but his fingers twitch, a tiny, involuntary movement, a crack in the mask. Melissa Bailey shifts, her gaze darting between Jake and her assistant. "Daniel?" Her voice is quieter now, wary. "What's he talking about?" Reeves stiffens, but only for a second. Then his mask of confidence slips back into place, his lips curling into something almost amused. "Melissa, please," he says smoothly, shaking his head. "He's a kid. A confused, attention-seeking kid. Do you seriously think—" "Answer the question," Judge Carmichael snaps. "Did you say those words or not?" Reeves's jaw tightens. For the first time, real tension flickers in his expression. Jake holds his breath. The moment hangs in the air, a loaded gun waiting to go off. And then, instead of answering, Reeves does something that makes the entire courtroom shift. He laughs, a short, quiet, knowing laugh. Then he turns to Melissa Bailey and speaks so softly that only she can hear. "You should have been smarter." Her breath catches. The realization dawns too late. A second later, Reeves bolts. He shoves past Melissa so hard that she stumbles. The bailiffs react instantly, but he's fast. Too fast. He makes it halfway to the courtroom doors before two uniformed officers block his path. "Get down, now!" Reeves skids to a halt, hands half raised. His chest heaves. The mask is gone. His cool, composed expression has shattered into something wilder. A man who knows he has lost. The entire courtroom erupts. The jury gasps, reporters fumble for their phones, and Dr. Wells lets out a breath of disbelief. Melissa Bailey stands frozen in place. Judge Carmichael slams his gavel so hard the sound echoes. "Silence! Bailiffs, take him into custody." The officers close in. Reeves doesn't fight. He doesn't say a word. Jake watches as Reeves is cuffed, as he's led toward the back of the courtroom. Before disappearing through the doors, the man casts one last glance at Jake, and for the first time, there is no amusement, only rage. Judge Carmichael turns to Jake, his expression unreadable. "Boy," he says slowly, "you just changed everything." And for the first time in weeks, Jake allows himself to breathe. The air in the courtroom crackles with tension. Every whisper, every movement is charged, as if the very walls are holding their breath. A child just accused a court official of a crime. Daniel Reeves doesn't move. His normally composed expression flickers for just a moment, something between disbelief and calculation. But then he does what men like him always do. He plays it off. "Judge," Reeves scoffs, shaking his head, "this is an insult to these proceedings. The defendant is a known liar, and now we're letting some kid throw wild accusations?" His voice is smooth, dismissive, but his knuckles tighten against the table. Jake doesn't back down. "You said those words," Jake insists, his voice steady now. "I heard you." Reeves lets out a sharp laugh, shaking his head, a little too much. "This is ridiculous," he says, glancing at Prosecutor Bailey. "Tell them, Melissa. Tell them how absurd this is." But Bailey isn't speaking. She's staring at him. Her mind isn't rejecting Jake's claim as quickly as it should. Her career, her reputation, everything she has built is tied to this case. And yet, a seed of doubt takes root. Because Jake isn't stammering. He isn't guessing. He is sure. Bailey's voice is quieter now. "Daniel," she repeats, slower this time. "What is he talking about?" Something shifts. For the first time, Reeves doesn't have a perfect response. He hesitates, just for a second. That second changes everything. Judge Carmichael's voice cuts through the noise. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Reeves until we verify this claim." And just like that, the courtroom ignites. The gallery erupts, gasps, voices overlapping, reporters scrambling to take notes. Dr. Wells, sitting in the defendant's chair, exhales sharply, gripping the table as if grounding himself in the moment. Jake watches it all unfold, his pulse hammering in his ears. Reeves doesn't react at first. He just stands there as two uniformed officers step forward, their hands hovering near their holsters. Then he laughs, low, sharp, dangerous. "You people are unbelievable," Reeves mutters. "Letting a child derail a case like this?" He turns, flashing a practiced smirk at the judge. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is a mistake." Judge Carmichael doesn't blink. Turn around, Mr. Reeves. Reeves doesn't move. The bailiffs step closer. Too close. And then, everything happens at once. Reeves lunges. Not toward the judge, not toward the prosecutor, toward Jake. The courtroom explodes into motion. A chair scrapes violently against the floor. People gasp, jumping to their feet. Reeves's hands lash out, but he's already too late. A bailiff intercepts him mid-motion, slamming him back against the table. Hands behind your back, now! Reeves fights. He struggles, muscles tensing, his breath ragged. His mask of professionalism is shattered. All that's left is raw, desperate anger. You little... Another bailiff grabs his arm, wrenching it back. The clink of handcuffs echoes through the chamber. Let me go, Reeves shouts, but it's over. Jake doesn't move. He can't. His legs feel frozen, his breath short. He just watches as the man who almost got away with it is finally pinned down. Prosecutor Bailey steps back, her face pale. Judge Carmichael exhales, slow and measured. Remove him from my courtroom. The bailiffs haul Reeves to his feet, his once pristine suit rumpled, his face flushed with rage. As they drag him past, his eyes lock onto Jake's. Something dark burns there. Hate. Jake doesn't flinch. Reeves is shoved through the side door, the echo of his footsteps fading. The silence left behind is thick, suffocating. Jake forces himself to breathe. Dr. Wells, still seated, looks at him. Really looks at him. There's something in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and relief, but most of all, gratitude. Jake swallows hard. He knows this isn't over, but for the first time since stepping into this courtroom, he knows he did the right thing. The courtroom is eerily quiet, save for the methodical clicking of handcuffs as they snap shut around Daniel Reeves's wrists. The polished, well-groomed assistant, once the picture of composure and arrogance, now stands disheveled and exposed, his suit crumpled, his face drained of color. It's over. The weight of the moment settles over the room like a dense fog. The jury stares, their expressions shifting from disbelief to something closer to betrayal. They were moments away from condemning an innocent man, and now the truth, so blatantly overlooked, sits in plain sight. Reeves, still in denial, shakes his head sharply. This is a mistake. His voice, once smooth and practiced, now sounds frantic, uneven. He turns his narrowed eyes toward Melissa Bailey. Melissa, come on, you know me. Bailey doesn't respond. She can't, because she doesn't know him. Not the way she thought she did. She had trusted him. She had built an entire case with his help, relied on his expertise, followed the paper trail he had manipulated, and she had been played. Her throat feels tight. She forces herself to speak. Take him out of my sight. The lead officer grips Reeves's arm, but the man twists violently, yanking himself free just for a second. His eyes lock onto Jake, and the mask shatters completely. You little brat. His voice is low, venomous, dripping with something far more dangerous than anger, hatred. Do you even realize what you've done? A sharp murmur spreads through the room. Some people recoil, as if expecting him to lunge at the boy right then and there. But Jake? He doesn't move. His heart is hammering. His palms are sweaty. But he can't, let Reeves see an ounce of fear. So he lifts his chin, squares his shoulders, and meets the man's glare with steely resolve. Yeah. Jake's voice doesn't shake. I stopped you. For a moment, Reeves just stares at him. Then, with a final sneer, he spits on the floor, jerking his arms against the officer's grip. Get me out of here. The officers don't hesitate. Reeves is hauled toward the exit, his shoes scuffing against the floor. The courtroom doors swing open, and as he disappears into the hallway, his angry protests fade into distant echoes. And then, the tension snaps. A collective exhale sweeps through the room. People shift in their seats, reeling from the chaos that had just unfolded. It feels surreal, like the entire case had flipped in an instant. Judge Carmichael, who had remained impassive through it all, finally moves. He adjusts his glasses, then turns to Dr. Wells. For the first time in weeks, the doctor looks like he can breathe again. His hands still tremble slightly against the defense table, but his eyes, once filled with quiet desperation, now hold something close to relief. Judge Carmichael gives a single decisive nod. "Dr. Wells, you are free to go." The words hit like a gavel strike. A moment of stillness, then a wave of emotion crashes through Dr. Wells. His shoulders drop as if someone just lifted an unbearable weight off him. He blinks rapidly, like he can't quite process it. Then he turns to Jake. Jake, who had risked everything to speak up. Jake, who had saved him. The doctor's voice is hoarse when he finally speaks. "Thank you." Jake exhales, finally letting his own nerves settle. Behind them, Melissa Bailey hasn't moved. She stands frozen, arms crossed, her expression locked in disbelief. Because this case, her case, had been so airtight. She had studied the evidence for weeks, built a flawless argument, delivered every word with conviction. And yet, she had almost destroyed an innocent man's life. Her gaze flickers toward Jake, the boy who had unraveled everything with a few simple words. She nods slowly, almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement. She was wrong, and he was right. The courthouse doors swing open, and a rush of cool air greets Jake as he steps outside. The tension inside still clings to him, the weight of everything that just happened pressing against his chest. His heartbeat hasn't slowed, his palms are still damp, but he forces himself to breathe. It's over. Justice had been served. The voices behind him, murmurs, hurried discussions, the scramble of reporters adjusting their cameras, all blur together. The storm hasn't settled yet, but Jake already feels like he's on the other side of it. A voice cuts through the noise. "Jake!" "Dr. Wells." Jake turns just as the man steps forward, his expression a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and something heavier. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a single sleepless night, but from weeks of carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He looks at Jake like he doesn't quite know what to say, like he's searching for words that will match the weight of what just happened. Finally, he exhales and settles on the only question that matters. "How did you know?" Jake shrugs, not out of indifference, but because there's no big, heroic answer. "I just listened." And that was the truth. Noticing things, remembering what people say when they think no one is paying attention, hearing the cracks in a lie when everyone else takes it at face value. It was something so simple, but it changed everything. Dr. Wells lets out a breath, a real one this time, one that isn't tight with stress or fear. He looks at Jake like he's seeing him for the first time. Then, he reaches out and rests a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You saved my life today." The words hit harder than Jake expects, because Wells isn't exaggerating. If Jake hadn't spoken up, the doctor would be in prison right now, labeled a thief, a fraud, a man who betrayed the very people he swore to heal, everything he built, destroyed, all because no one had bothered to look twice at the evidence. Jake meets Wells' gaze, and for the first time since this all started, something inside him settles. Then, chaos. The reporters, who had been waiting like predators smelling blood, pounce. "Jake, how did you uncover the truth?" "Were you afraid to speak up?" "Dr. Wells, what will you do now?" Microphones are shoved forward, cameras flash, voices overlap in a tangle of demands for answers. Wells instinctively steps forward, as if to shield Jake, but the boy just lets out a quiet chuckle. He's still standing, still breathing. This? This part doesn't scare him. He turns toward the cameras, the journalists, the onlookers waiting to hear something dramatic. But he doesn't give them theatrics. He just smiles slightly and says, "I just wanted the truth." A murmur spreads through the crowd, not the sensational quote they were hoping for, but the only one that matters. Jake doesn't wait for more questions. He steps away from the noise, from the flashing lights, and the hungry curiosity of people who, just hours ago, were ready to believe a lie. He walks down the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets, his mind finally catching up to everything that just happened. And for the first time since the trial began, since he realized what was happening, since he felt that twist of dread in his gut that told him something wasn't right, Jake knows. He did the right thing. The truth had frozen the courtroom, but it had also set an innocent man free.